Welcome to another C++ tutorial. I'm Ghost, and today we'll be creating a beginner-friendly project called Password Manager. In this program, you'll be able to create passwords to accounts that you own, which will then save to a text file locally on your computer. If you are a beginner C++ programmer, then this video is perfect for you. If you are not, then I recommend clicking on the card above, which will link to a more intermediate version of this project. I will also leave a link to the repository in the description below. If you wish to download this project, you're more than welcome to do so. With all that out the way, let's begin. All right, so I got VS Code open and we're just gonna create a new file here. This will be our main.cpp file. Now, this is beginner friendly, so we're just gonna use only one file for the whole entire program. Okay, so the first thing I did was just include a bunch of libraries that we're gonna need. We have your IO stream, you have the fstream, you have the limits, and you have the string. Technically, you don't need this because part of the IO string, it is included inside there. I'm not gonna go over exactly each and every one of these libraries. I assume that you know a little bit about how they work. Maybe in another video I could talk about that. But anyways, so we're gonna write our entry. I'm not sure if you know this, but you don't actually have to give a return when you have your entry function, but I will. So we will return 0, which will terminate the program. Okay, so what we want to do first is that we want to create local variables that we will use throughout the program. And right now we just need 3. Okay, so there they are. The first one that we have here is integer. We identified it as choice. Basically what that's going to do is hold a variable for the choice that you give per the menu that will be available. Like for instance, choice 1 would be add a password, choice 2 would be to view password, and choice 3 would be just to exit the program. So that would just hold whatever choice that you input. Then you have 2 strings here. We have the site for the actual site of the password that you want to record, and then the actual password. You don't actually need to separate it like that, right? It's okay to have it like this because they are of the same type. So you could just put a comma and then put as many identifiers as you want. I could actually put another identifier here if I want to, and it'll still work. Okay, so moving on. The next thing that we need is a loop. We don't want to come down here and then terminate the program too quickly. We need to stay in this constant loop until the user decides that they want to terminate the program. And we're going to do so with a while loop, but more specifically a do while loop. I'm not sure if you understand the difference between a while loop or a do while loop, but let me first write it out and then I'll explain it. Okay, so here it is. The purpose of a do while loop is that the loop executes at least once, as opposed to just a regular while loop, which would be written like this, while. So yeah, that's the key difference. Here, this condition must be true in order to even run the logic that would be in the brackets here, as opposed to this, which will run that logic at least once before evaluating the condition here. And in this case, we want it to run at least once because we didn't initialize choice up here, and that will be handled inside of here when we actually look for the input. So we do need to run the logic at least once before we evaluate the condition to decide whether we should break out of the loop or not. Okay, so next, before we continue anything else in the main function, I want to create a function for printing to the actual console, which is just displaying a message to the console. Since we will be displaying lots of messages, I don't want to just use cout constantly. I'd rather just wrap that around a function. I'm assuming that you understand what cout is. So anyways, let's just create this function. Okay, so we constructed our function. It's called display message. It accepts a constant string reference, and then we just simply use the cout and then the end line. I'll break this down real quick. If you don't know what end L is, it stands for end line. Basically, it just adds a new line. So that way it prints that, and then the cursor goes to the next line. That's pretty much it. If I didn't include that, like if I got rid of that, then what would happen is it will display that message, but that cursor will stay just right there on that same line. So if you try to print again, it'll just print on the same line over and over, and we don't want that. So we just leave the end line there, and that way we just go to a new line every time we print. Now, breaking down the parameter, the constant, and the reason why we label it as a constant is because we don't want to accidentally change anything about this message. And then as far as reference, this is the more important one. is that we don't want to make a copy. And now this would be a little bit more advanced. I'm trying to not go there with this video, but a long story short is that everything relates to memory, right? So you don't want to create more memory, and you want to just use a reference to some memory that you already made somewhere else, which will be down here when you actually are calling this message. Okay, so for example, we have the display message here, and if we were to take the site, now pretend it does have some value to it. This right here line creates memory for site for this variable, and if we don't pass it as a reference, we basically are just creating a copy of it and wasting memory. So it's best to just pass as a reference. Other than that, we're done with that function. So let's just move on. All right, so let's go back to our loop. The first things first is we want to display some menu for the user so that way they know what to do. Now we could do it like this, where we call the function over and over and over in this loop, but it looks a bit messy. So it's best if we just wrap this in a function as well and call it like display menu. Okay, so there we go, much cleaner. Now we have this custom function up here called display menu. It has no parameters, so it doesn't accept any arguments. All it simply does is just display the whole entire menu. It calls the display message a couple times to display each line, and we just simply call it right here in the beginning of the loop. Now there is a way to just call this function once and just put the whole entire string inside there. But I'm not going to do that. Like I said, this is beginner friendly, so we just called it multiple times to display the whole entire function. But to go over the menu and to have some sort of outlook on what the program is going to do, we can see here the first line is just the password manager title. The second line will be choice 1, which remember, you have to select a choice and it's saved here as an integer. So choice 1 allows you to add a password. Choice 2 allows you to view all the passwords that you have saved. And then choice 3 allows you to exit the program, which will break this loop as you see down here. And then this line here was just for you to enter your choice. Anyways, moving on. Next, what we need to do is we need to actually look for input from the user. So we're going to use cin. This is pretty straightforward. We just use the cin from the STL, the standard library, into our local variable choice of type integer. But now there is a problem that can arise. Let's say if you were to input F or like something like that, like anything that's not numerical, it will cause a problem where it will indefinitely keep running the loop, bypassing that input on the next cycle and just pretty much go haywire. So in case of that event, we're going to handle that type of error with this validation. And it looks like this. So first things first is we want to see if the cin failed. If the user does type in like anything besides a numerical value, the flag will be raised. So this will be a true statement. We want to clear any flags, and that's what this does here. And the next thing that we want to do is that we want to ignore anything that's in the buffer. Now, I don't want to go too deep into that because that goes beyond the scope of beginner friendly. But long story short, what is happening is that input that the user gave, which is not numerical, which is like this, like FSDFS or just whatever, even if it's just F, right? It's not numerical. What happens is that's still stored in the buffer because it didn't know what to do with that because it can't insert something that's not numerical into a type integer. That's what creates that chaos. But what happens is this line just pretty much removes it from there, so that way it could clear it completely out and go back to a normal state. Anyways, I'm not trying to get too technical with that to keep it beginner friendly, but just include this because it's very important to handle that possible case. Next, what we want to do is once we reach this point, we should have a choice, meaning that the user did input some numerical value, even if it's not in the range of, like in this case, 1, 2, or 3. Even if it's not in that range, it's still some numerical value, and what we need to do is handle that, and we will handle that in a switch case. So for those of you who don't know what a switch case is basically, think of it like if-else statements. but better. What happens is that it evaluates what choice is. So let's say choice is number 1. Then what will happen is okay, that's better. I just wrote it out real quick. So what will happen is that it'll go to that specific case. That's why it's called switch case. So if choice, let's say, is number 1, it'll go to this right here. Think of it like brackets, how they work, how this, I could just like type in whatever logic I want, and that's for that specific scope. There's this scope here, 1, 2, 3, and then there's this other scope here, which I'll explain in a little bit, but let's go back up. So let's say it's choice 1, it'll then run choice 1 logic. If it's choice 2, it'll run choice 2. If it's choice 3, it'll run choice 3. And if it's anything besides any of these cases, then it'll just run the default. So that's what the default is for. Now, the reason why a switch case is so much better than an if statement is because an if statement has to evaluate all the conditions there. So like, let's say if we were to okay, so what you see here is that this if statement is pretty much equivalent to the switch case, but the key difference here is that let's say the user enters 8, right? So 8 obviously is not 1, 2, or 3. So what has to happen is that it has to run through each one individually. So it has to check for this one. Okay, no, then it has to go to this one. Nope, not that one. It has to go to this one, not that one. And then obviously the only other possible solution is this else, because the choice is equals 8 and it's not any of the first ones. The key difference here is that instead of going through every single case, it goes directly to that case that it actually is. So in this case, if the user enters a numerical value of number 8, instead of even attempting to check these, it already knows it's not that. It'll just go straight to default. And in another case, if they enter correctly, like let's say number 1, or no, let's just say number 2, then it will just go directly to number 2. But going back up here, it'll have to first check if it's number 1 and it's not that, so then it has to go to this one, and then it is number 2, so then finally it'll go to that one. So as you can see, it's pretty much more efficient to use a switch case in this case. Anyways, let's move on. All right, so let's start with case 1. So as you could recall, case 1 is pretty much the number 1 in the menu, which is to add a password. So what we want to do first is we need to get input from the user, right? And that input will be for the site and password, because we need to know, well, you know, what site are we referring to, and then what is the password for that site, and then take all of that and save it to the file, because that's the point of this whole entire project. So anyways, let's write that out. Okay, so what we want to do first is that we want to display a message to the user to enter the site name, so that way essentially we are prompting them to do just that, right? We don't want to have the user write the site name and the password all at once, so we prompt them to do that. We use cin to push that input into the site variable, which remember it's up here. And then we prompt the user again to now enter a password and then insert it into password. Pretty straightforward. And the last thing that we want to do is we want to actually save the password. So we're going to have this function here called save password, which we will pass in the site and the password as arguments, but we didn't create it yet. So let's just comment it out and we will create that now. Okay, so we have our function here. I know it seems like a lot. Don't worry, I'll go over everything line by line. First thing we're going to look at is the actual parameters. Just like we did with the display message with the const type string reference, we're basically doing the same thing here. So I'm not going to explain that. So with this first line here, what we're doing is we are opening up a file. In this case, it's going to be called passwords, and the extension is going to be text, which is basically just a text file. If you are familiar with text files, we are saving that to the OF stream, which just stands for output file stream. That is from this library up here, the F stream. What this line states is that we are creating a object, OF stream, and we're passing in arguments to the constructor. Now, I don't know if you know much about constructors, classes. Maybe I can go over that in another video, but let's say you do. What we are doing is just passing in information into that class, so that way it knows how to handle this file and how we want to open it. So the first argument just states the actual name of the file. Whether it exists or it doesn't, that's two different things, but this is the name to the file that we are attempting to open. The second argument here, could be considered, I guess, a little more advanced, but not so much. I'm gonna explain it real briefly. What it does is tells the object what mode we are trying to open the file in. And in this case, what app means is to append. So put it like this, let's say this file already existed. What we want to do is we don't want to overwrite the file. What we want to do is actually just add new information to it. So append is basically doing just that. We're appending new information to the next line at the end of the file. This just states that we want to open the file in append mode, so whatever we write to it is just appended below. Next, what we want to do is we want to check if the file is actually open, because in some cases there could be an error and it just didn't open the file. So there is a function that this object has called isOpen, and all it does is just checks, is the file open? If there was some error, then it would be closed and this would be false. So then we would run the else statement, which the else statement in this case just lets us know that there was an error. So let's say the file opened correctly, then we're going to run this logic here. This line here, all it does is it takes our file, which by the way, I'm not sure if I stated it, but file is the identifier for this object, and the actual file that we open. So what this does here is that it takes in the information that we pass to this function, site and password, and it pretty much inserts all of that, including this little space in between the two and this line break at the end, and that's what it stands for. It takes all of that and it inserts it into this file right here. After we are done inserting this new password, we then want to close the file. Now technically you don't have to have this line here. Like once it goes out of scope, the file will close automatically, but for best practices it's best that you include this line, and just to let other programmers know that now the file is closing, you no longer need to do anything with that file. Lastly here, we just display a message letting the user know that the password has saved successfully, and that's it. That's our function. We can come back down here, we can uncomment this, and now case one is complete. So when the user wants to add a new password and they select this from the menu, it will come into this case. It will run all of this logic from displaying the messages for prompting the user to enter their site, then the password, and then finally it will take that information, pass it into the save password function, which will then open up the file. Whether it exists or it doesn't, it will open up that text file called passwords, check if it's open, and if it is open, it will write the new information to that file, then close it, and then display this message. And if something went wrong, it will display this message. All right, so for case two, we just want to have this function here that we didn't create, but we will, that will just load the passwords, because if the user selects number two, which is view passwords, we want to handle getting the passwords from the file and viewing them. Anyways, let's just create this load passwords function. First things first, we'll comment this out. Okay, so we have our load passwords function here. Now the load passwords does not accept any arguments. It has no parameters because we don't need anything. All we have to do is what we did earlier in save passwords, is that we have to open the file, and then we'll go through the whole validating, making sure the file is open. And if it isn't, we run this else statement, which just lets them know that something went wrong, or in this case we just have this no password saved yet, which I guess we could just leave like that. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that that could be the issue, it could be some other issue, but in this case we'll just leave it like that for now. So going to the first line here, we do the same thing like we did in password. Now the difference here is that you notice we didn't add this to here. It's because we don't need that. We're not appending anything to this file. All we really are doing is looking at the file, so we don't really need to do anything with it but open it. Also, actually, if you notice, the types are different. So if you look at the save password here, it's the OF stream, which remember stands for output file stream. And if you look at this object here, it's actually IF stream. And if you guessed it, it stands for input file stream. So the difference here is that in this case, when we're saving, we actually want to output information, so that's why we use the OF stream. And for the load passwords, we're not outputting, we're just inputting. We're getting information from a file, so we're using the fstream. Now, there is another way to handle this, but for beginner friendly, once again, I feel like this is the best way, that we specifically use these different classes and we define these very specific objects for outputting or inputting. So we'll just continue with that and leave the more complicated stuff for another video. So anyways, continuing, we do our check, right, as stated before, and let's say the file opened, so we're good. What we want to do is we want to create these local variables here, much like we did in main, but in this case, because we need to get the information from the file, so we create these local variables, site and password, because we need both. We display this message, and then we create this while loop. Now, all this really states is that we're taking our file that should be open, and we're inserting the information from it into these variables. Now, since, remember, we added a space, if we go back up here, we added a space right here in between the site and password. So what's going to happen is that when we are looking at this file and we're going line by line, because this is what this is going to do, it's going to go line by line, it's going to know that that space exists there. So it's going to be able to accurately get that information for site. And then we use another insertion to then go beyond that space and then go into password, because it's going to capture the actual string and ignore that space. In essence, the file formatting is important, and that's how I decided to format it, using the space in between here. So that's what that's going to do. So with each iteration, basically each line, all it's going to do is just print out every single site and password that you have into this nice string here. Now, in this case, I should have used the display message function up here, but it's a little more difficult with this one because we had to insert variables into actual string literals. So this function is not set up to do that, and I didn't want to change that right now. So I just decided to just do this one manually instead of using the display message function up here. After all of that is done and it displays all the passwords, it will then just run the file close, and that's it. We're done. For this last case, it's very simple. You're pretty much not doing anything at all, but just displaying a message. And this message will be that it's exiting, right? Because remember, in the menu up here, if the user chooses option 3, we just exit. So we just let the user know that it's exiting. It's pretty much straightforward. Lastly, for the default, now remember that is in the event that the user presses, or I should say inputs, any numerical value that isn't 1, 2, or 3, we need to display some message to let them know that this is an invalid choice. And remember that default will run if choice doesn't equal any one of these cases. So we simply just display this message here, which says invalid choice, please try again. And what will happen is once it reaches the bottom here and choice obviously is not 3, it will just go back up and start a new iteration, display the menu and prompt for input, and just continue all over again. Besides that, that's the end. That's the end of our program, and we are ready to test it. All right, so I'm going to quickly compile this and then we're going to test it. So let's say G++. Yeah, we'll just use this. The executable will just be called P, I guess, and then we'll just run it. And as you see here, well, I'm not sure, you're not going to be able to see it that good. Let me make it a little bit bigger. So as you see here, we're prompted with the menu, so we can add a password. So let's just add a password. We'll say Hulu for the site, and then some gibberish for the password. And then if we choose now option 2 to view the passwords, we'll see that it is saved. Save passwords, site, Hulu, password, right? Let's add just 2 more. Say Netflix, and some more gibberish, and add another one, and say Red Note, gibberish. Check that, and we see that we have our 3 passwords saved. Now we can just exit the program because we want to check if it actually persists. So we exited the program, right? Let's just clear screen, and let's just run the program again. Now we're gonna see if the memory did persist in between, like running the program, exiting the program, and then coming back into the program. So if we choose number 2, which is view passwords, we'll see that the memory did persist because the memory is actually saved to a file, and I'll show you that file right now. Okay, so as you see here, this is the program here. This is our actual source code. Don't worry about that. But this is the actual file that was saved, the password text file. So if I double click on it, we'll see that it's all right here, right? Now it's in plain English. It's not encrypted or none of that stuff. I'm gonna actually go over that in the outro, but it works. Okay, so that is the end of this tutorial. Now, as stated already, this is a beginner project. There is an intermediate version of this project. I will have the card up there if it's available already. I'm not sure if it's out right now, but that is where we go over more things like encryption, because when we save the password, we don't want to just save in plain English. We want to actually encrypt it so other people can't see it. That version also goes over buffering, so that way we don't keep writing to file and reading from file, like every time we select from the menu. That version also has a admin password, so that way you can't access the program unless you actually know the password. It includes a more modular program and also just some other concepts meant for more intermediate C++ programmers. But anyways, if you enjoyed this video and you found it useful, please make sure to like and subscribe. Also remember, there is a link to the repository in the description if you would like to download it. If you didn't want to write it out from scratch, you're more than welcome to do so. Anyways, that is it for now. Thanks for watching. Until next time.